Hi guys, so today we're going to start on chapter 7. We're going to be talking about lists. So if you'll notice that the title of chapter 7 is lists and tuples, but in fact we're only going to talk about lists. Tuples are somewhat similar. If you're interested in the content, you're welcome to read it, but we're just going to talk about lists just for brevity because that's what's in the syllabus. So you only have to worry about the first part of this chapter. Alright, so we're going to talk about sequences, introductions to lists, list slicing, finding items in lists with the in operator, list methods, and useful built-in list functions. We're also going to talk about copying lists and processing lists. We're not going to talk about two-dimensional lists or tuples or plotting list data. If you're interested in this, especially the plot stuff for some of you guys that are science majors, it's really useful. Go and take a look at that, but it's really just uses lists and functions in a library. So it's something you can just pick up on your own super easy. So take a look, but we're just going to cover the topics that I mentioned. Alright, so a sequence is an object that contains multiple items of data. So items are stored in sequence one after the other. So um, this is a slightly different thing from some of you people who are Java or C programmers have seen in the past. There are things kind of like this, but they're not base language constructs, whereas in Python they are a base language construct. But Python has different types of sequences. They have lists and tuples in particular. What's going to talk about in this chapter, we're only going to talk about lists. Um, Again, the difference between these basically is that a list is immutable and a tuple is immutable. So immutable means we can change it, and a tuple immutable means that we can't change it. So really the only difference between a list and a tuple is that we can't change the tuple and we can change the list, but we can actually go back and forth between the two fairly easily. So if you know how to do lists, the things that you can do with a tuple is just a subset of the things you can do with lists, so it's pretty straightforward. Alright, so a list is an object that contains multiple data items. We've looked at lists in the past. We've used them quite a bit when we do loops. For for loops, remember we always loop over lists. So an element is an item in a list, and then the format of the list to declare a list, it's just, you've seen this before, it's just list equals and then square brackets and then a list of items in there. So a list can hold different types. It can hold strings or numbers or whatever you want to put in there. It actually can hold anything. We can use the print function to display an entire list. And then we can actually use the list in parentheses function that'll convert certain types of objects to lists. So here's an example. We can have a list that's a list of integers, and we just have maybe just even integers. So we have 2, 4, 6, 10. We could also just have a list of strings, or we could have a list that actually holds mixed types. So if you look at this bottom list, it holds strings, it holds integers, it holds floats. So we can actually mix the types in the list. It doesn't have to be a single type. Alright, so we have this repetition operator, and whether or not this is useful to you, you'll have to decide. But what it does is makes multiple copies of a list and joins them together. So the star symbol is the repetition operator when applied to a sequence and an integer. So the syntax is going to be sequence star integer, and the sequence is on the left, the numbers are right. The number is going to tell you how many copies of it you're going to make. So it's going to make multiple copies of the list. Let's say your list had ABC in it, and you said times 3. You're going to get ABC, ABC, ABC in your new list. It's going to have 9 elements instead of 3. It's going to be a copies of the original one. And again, we've seen this before with for loops. You can loop over the elements on a list using for. In fact, this is the only way to use for loops. So we say for x in list, and you remember when we did it with numbers, we used the range operator. But if you recall, what the range operator does is it just generates a list of numbers, sequential numbers, or sequential numbers with skips, right? So range is actually just generating a list, and the for loop is always going to loop over a list. So for x in list is the syntax that we've used for everything when we used for loops. Again, very useful. Alright, so indexing. So an index is a number specifying the position of an element in a list. We saw this with strings. So strings, we pretty much treat them like a list of characters. Internally, they're slightly different, but very similar. So the index of the first element in the list is always 0, right? We've seen this before. The second element is 1, and then the very final element is n minus 1. So we can use negative indexes, which I've seen some of you guys use in your string program actually. You can use negative indexes to specify positions relative to the end of the list. So index -1 is the last element, -2 is the next to last element, etc., etc. So if we start with 0 and we go forward, then we're 0th is the first one, 1 is the second one, etc., etc. If we say, list name bracket -1, that's the last element in the list. -2 is the next to last element, etc., etc., etc. All right. So we have so if you try to use an index, let's say you want to do things in your list, and you want to use an index, and you pick an index that is outside of the range of acceptable indexes. So what's going to happen if you do that is you're going to get this index error exception that's going to get thrown. And we talked about exceptions already, but you're going to get an index error exception if you use an invalid index. So if, let's say your list has 15 items in it, and you go list 1 bracket 15, that's actually the 16th element of the list. You're going to get this index error exception. So if you want to get the length of your list, there's a function called len. It will return the length of a sequence such as a list. We actually saw this for strings too. We have the same function that works the same way. Again, the strings in Python, a lot of them are sort of designed to work just like lists. So we can say size equals len mylist, and it returns the number of elements in the list. So again, the last element in the list is always the length of the list minus 1. So we can use this to prevent an index error exception when we're looping over a list with a loop. Again, probably what we'd be doing with this if we really wanted to loop over it, it would just say, like 4x in list, whatever our list name is, if we want to loop over the list. Almost always the way that you should do it in Python, you should pretty much never generate a list of numbers and then go through the list of numbers unless you're doing something very special. That is not the common use case. All right, so we're going to stop right here, and I am going to continue with the rest of this in the next video.